Welcome to the Wednesday, January 27th regular meeting of the Lane County Board of Commissioners. We've extended our meeting from yesterday to work on topic 19 from County Council. We have both A, announcements, but B, the bulk of our meeting will be discussing redistricting options for the Lane County Board of Commissioners. Mr. Dingle, are there announcements or any commissioners? No? Mr. Mograhici?
No announcements.
Then if you would, sir, why don't you lead us through this discussion?
Thank you, Chair Bernie and members of the board. You should have had the memorandum that I prepared. I tried to follow I went back and looked at the both of the sessions that we had on this. What I understood, particularly from you, Commissioner Bernie, was that you wanted a sort of a timeline and a checklist of the steps that the board has to go through. I think you've received a lot of information and you have a lot of options. For the benefit of Commissioner Trieger, who I know wasn't a commissioner when those other meetings, those listening sessions were held, I went back and tried to sort of summarize there was a lot of overlap in terms of what people said, but on the different decision points that you had, I tried to at least consolidate that down so that you could see generally what people were saying they wanted. And I know that you've received some other emails, and really there hasn't been anything too new under the sun. So what I did was set it up for you to start making decisions. And I think I started with, and I know that I tried to make sort of what, if you will, the easier ones. I think the more difficult ones are going to be how you select those other members, if you will. That brings us into the retired judges and the other things. But certainly it seems to me that today, after discussing it amongst yourselves, the board could certainly, I think, reach a decision about how many members you want on the committee. Number two would be without deciding whether or not, and I can address it when it comes up as a topic. I know there's been a lot of back and forth among people about whether or not folks should be disqualified because of whether they ran in the past or promised not to run in the future and make a campaign contribution. But we can certainly start doing the outline of an application, because it seemed to be, I tried to pick places where I thought there was 100% consensus. And it seemed to me that there was 100% consensus from the board that there should be an application process, that it shouldn't just be random or anything like that. So we could certainly, board could give direction to staff to start developing that application process, or that application, at least the form of it, what it would look like, what information you would want to try and gather from folks. And three, I believe it's really important to get the committee structure, and we can start doing that again, in place before you start making these decisions to avoid some of the potential conflicts. And what do I mean by that? For example, making sure that before the whole process starts, there's agreement about what will happen if someone, if a member of the commission ends up being unable to serve, they become ill or they have a family emergency. Number two, put in some key definitions, because I'm not sure that there's a total agreement about this. I know there's a lot of discussion about adding specific or having people with specific characteristics on the committee. So that means if there is to be like a position that is a position for a person of color, that be defined, that if there's a position for a rural person or an urban person, that be defined. If there's a position for a low-income person, that term be defined, and to get all of that done up front so that to lessen the risk of controversy and dispute when the actual applications are being screened and when the actual selections are being made. If that makes sense. Again, it seems to me that my experience has been that if the rules are agreed upon up front, there's far less likely to be controversy later when they're applied. The problem you run into is when there is no definition, for example, of a low-income person or a rural person, and then someone wants to appoint someone, and then we get into a fight about whether or not they really are a quote-unquote rural person or really a low-income person. So that's just basically the way that I've set it up. And I do think that, as I mentioned at the end, I do think that there's absolutely a bunch of stuff that you can do prior to ever receiving. I know a number of the board members mentioned this. I think Commissioner Buck mentioned it, and I think Chair Bernie did. there's a lot of this work that can be done before we ever get the information from PSU. We don't need the information from PSU to set up the structure for the committee or make a decision about the qualifications of the applicants or the selection process. None of that is dependent upon getting the information from PSU. That's really my introduction, and it's really your meeting. So I'll turn it over to you at this point.
Well, I mean, Council, I apologize, but I'm going to keep you engaged in this one.
Oh, that's fine.
So for the benefit of all of us, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this is an item which is a big deal, the districting and redistricting. My understanding is only one of us, actually, only Commissioner Bozovich, you were here the last time this occurred. And my understanding is that it became a very partisan, or at least the optics were, it became sort of controversial. And so, you know, I've read all of the emails, and frankly, I expected many more eyes on this and much more public input when we had our input sessions. And there wasn't a lot. The seminal input, which I believe is in this documentation, was from the League of Women Voters and the Democratic Party of Lane County. Although Commissioner Trieger, just FYI, and you probably already know this, but we have a whole list of folks we invited input from. And it just wasn't what we thought. We're now, if you notice, starting to receive emails from people. It seems like maybe a little more attention. And I think that we just have to do this with the understanding that this is democracy. We're in the environment that we're in. While it's incredibly imperative, if you look at the material Mr. Dingle provided us, it starts with identifying sort of the conclusions that the previous board came to, and it identifies decision points. Before I asked Mr. Dingle, decision point by decision point, to give us sort of a little his intro or synopsis, why he needs that. At this point, are there any commissioners that would like any statements before we dive into this process? Commissioner Trieger.
Thank you, Chair Bernie, and good morning, everyone. As the person who was not in the seat when this conversation started last year, 10 years ago, it feels like COVID. As the person who was not present for the meetings last year as you started to embark on this work, I just wanted to state broadly, first of all, I was paying some attention. I did tune into both of the meetings that are referenced in these materials in September and December, and I believe I even presented some testimony alluding to an opinion about a particular aspect of this process. So I wanted to let folks know I'm not as deep dive familiar as the rest of you, but also not brand new to it today. While none of us other than Commissioner Bozovich were on the board at the time of the last redistricting, we were all in the community, and I know for myself, I was also again at that time paying attention to the process. And it's my understanding that the crux of the controversy, if you will, was actually about the board's role in selecting from the options presented versus creating an option that hadn't been presented by the committee and through the process that had been agreed upon. So I think it's just important to call that out, because I think the process and criteria for selecting a committee is one bucket of work, but also the commitment as a board to what we will do with those recommendations is another piece. And finally, for now, I want to just ask a point of clarification from County Council. The last redistricting maps were adopted in 2014. We're required to do this no less than every 10 years. So if I'm understanding this rightly, while we do ideally want to get this done in time for the 22 election, 6 months before election day 22, we're not actually obligated to do so until prior to the 24 election. Is that correct? Thank you.
Yes, if you look at the charter, it says not less than every 10 years. So, and I did target, obviously one of those dates is just not even, I laid out the potential elections that it could apply to. The charter requires that whatever redistricting plan is going to be used must be adopted 180 days before the election. And so that would mean, obviously, the first one is completely off the table. We just can't make that timetable. But the more realistic one is the election that you mentioned. And that's the one that I sort of established the timeline for. And you could obviously truncate that timeline, but again, it's really dependent. I mean, it's really dependent on receiving the information from Portland State. We could have everything set up and geared up, but if we don't have the information, then we can't do it. And the other piece I wanted to mention is make sure, I believe, did all of the members, board of commissioners, get the solicitation, which I was unsolicited about a software? I know that came up too, as well as the soft. I see Commissioner Trigger shaking her head.
Just yesterday,
I just want you to know that was unsolicited. But it's obviously, this is out here, and there's businesses that are obviously trying to get public bodies to buy their software to use during the redistricting process.
Commissioner Trigger again. Sorry, can you just clarify what the one piece I'm not familiar with is what we're waiting for on from PSU?
I believe what we're waiting for is all of the census data that would be, as Commissioner Bozovich mentioned, I don't know, but I'm sure it's going to be better than it was 10 years ago, where you would literally draw on a map and it would essentially instantly pop up with all of that census data. How many people over a certain age, income, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Are there any other commissioners that would? Commissioner Farr.
Thank you, Chair Bernie. The only thing I'd say is that I have been part of two redistricting efforts on elected bodies, both with the city of Eugene, Eugene City Council. First was a heavy lift, and the second was an adjustment. Heavy lifts can be fairly not controversial, but have a great deal of input. And the one with the Eugene City Council actually placed one sitting councillor outside of his district, and that was Gary Rare. And because it was such a smooth process, Gary was fine with the redistricting. It did not, because it was a clear and easy to understand process. And I agree with the Commissioner Trigger's statement regarding the process, that it's got to be understandable and people have optics of fairness and impartiality in redistricting. You know, and we compare that to the redistricting of the state districts, which has the University of Oregon and Shed in the same district, and originally had Cheshire and Chambers and 6th Avenue in the same district. You know, that clearly manipulated districts. So we can avoid that. We don't have to do it. And I'm looking forward to the process that really raises no eyebrows when the final decisions are made.
Agreed, Commissioner. I have a question, and forgive my naivete, but 10 years ago, I lived in this community when this occurred, the last time redistricting occurred. I lived in this community, but my work was in California, and I was out building stuff and not paying as close attention as many. Commissioner Bozovich, I do have a question for you, if I may, sir, and that is, some of the emails identified that that a body provided 3 options to the Board of Commissioners, and the Board of Commissioners didn't select either. And that seemed, from what I was reading from our input, to be the crux of some controversy. Could you share with us, is that correct? If so, why? Just your perspective, and then we'll start digging into this stuff if there's no other commissioner statements.
I'm trying to remember exactly the process at that time, so forgive me, it has been 10 years.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm surprised you with the question. I didn't mean to catch you off guard.
Yeah. I think the commission came back with a recommendation to basically leave the districts alone at that time, which was an issue for the board at that time after the both the legislative decision to split Eugene Springfield's UGB down I-5 and the fact that the Springfield district crossed I-5 into Eugene. So we went back to, there were 3 options that the committee was choosing from, and we went back to one of the options that wasn't leave things alone. And that's what created a lot of the controversy. Is we went, they had narrowed it down to 3 and chose one, and the board decided to go back to one of the 3 that wasn't chosen by the committee for the reason of trying to fix the Springfield issue, and also that the newer districts had a better population balance and did a few other things, like the East Lane commissioner was not representing people west of Notai and Walton, which the district at that time did, went all the way past Walton to the west. And there were some other issues with how the districts were kind of drawn. Springfield representing Eugene residents. There was some issues that we tried to take care of. One of the ones is how annexation was affecting the districts, and we tried to draw the boundaries out to UGBs rather than city limits, so that as property annexed, they would stay in the same commissioner's district. But anytime the commission gets involved in picking, there's going to be an appearance that we picked based on how we wanted our voters to be, or there was some skullduggery in the fact that we picked an option. So that's why it's kind of important that as we go through this, I'm a proponent of setting the rules up to where only one option comes forward from the committee, and it goes to an up or down vote of the commissioners. And if we go no, it goes back to the committee to come up with a new recommendation. And we go back and forth until we adopt one, rather than having the committee put forward a group of options and then we pick. We're in that same situation we were 10 years ago, where we picked amongst options, unlike they did 20 years ago, where the board came up with its own option in a back room and presented it basically on the day they voted for it. That was even worse in a lot of ways. For me, it's really important that we set up a committee that appears independent from the commissioners, that is balanced, so people don't feel like it's being controlled by one particular group or another. There's transparency, obviously open meetings laws, and the meetings are open to the public. And they come up, with a recommendation of the board based on being, that follow our charter, follow the Secretary of State's recommendations, follow state, federal law, and court precedent as far as how election districts should be set up. Following general geographic boundaries, keeping communities of interest together, all the various things that we've seen over time. At the same time, matching up to our charter descriptions of having the 2 rural commissioners, the 2 Eugene commissioners, a Springfield commissioner, and the general boundaries that you would associate with those 5 positions. So for me, the important part is that, folks look at the committee and think it's independent, balanced, and that their process is transparent, that they only bring one recommendation forward to the board that we do an up or down vote on, because that eliminates the issue we had, last time, which we sort of did. We basically tossed one of the recommendations, but one of the things maybe that brought controversy was we picked from one of the other ones without sending it back to the committee and saying, we don't like the option you brought forward. Can you bring us another one? And let the committee bring one forward rather than we brought one forward. So that's probably the thing that generated the controversy. Unlike 10 years before that, where the commissioners didn't like what the committee brought forward and they drew their own option.
Thank you, Commissioner, very much. Commissioner Buck.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to roll back to a comment made earlier regarding the 2024 year. I was hoping to flesh that out a little bit. I didn't catch that whole that whole comment and wanted to know a little bit more about that, because it's my understanding we need to do our redistricting before October 26th, which was the date our redistricting occurred 10 years ago. But I didn't catch what the 2024 year reference was.
Either Mr. Dingle or Commissioner Trieger.
Yeah. I must have been, you want to go ahead, Commissioner Trieger?
Thank you, Chair Bernie. Yeah, I was simply asking for clarification of whether our timeline was wedded to the 22 election versus the 24 election, given that the last adoption was in 2014, 10 years is 24, not 22. So I was asking for that clarification. To be clear, regardless, I think we must develop a process, an application criteria, a seating selection process, even if we could wait to seat the committee and adopt for the 24 election. But I wanted that clarification.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I don't believe that the last time it was, it was done before I got here in 2012. So it had been adopted before I got here. So I misunderstood. It wasn't adopted in 2014.
Thank you.
Mr.
Dingle marks history by when he arrived on the scene.
Wow. I just know that it was all over and done, and I was not a part of the process when I arrived in January of 2012. So it must have occurred prior to that date.
Thank you. I apologize for creating confusion. When the last process had concluded. Thank you.
Commissioner Buck, did I see your hand?
Yeah, I had a second question, and that is regarding what we're trying to accomplish today. So today, I was really seeking and hoping that our board would clarify exactly who we want in our committee so that we can get that committee process going. I know we still probably have differing opinions about what we want to do with the output from that committee, whether we want one option. I personally would like several options because I think there's a time lag. If you ask the committee to bring you one and yay or nay, if it's a nay, they go back and you have to keep doing this over and over until there's one that everybody agrees on. But I think that is a further conversation. We have all morning, we could get into it, but I'm really hoping today we can start with the committee, get those parameters up and going so that after this meeting, Mr. Dingle can go out and get those applications out there to the public, get the public, aware that we're asking for applications, figure out who we're going to get in the group and start getting them educated. I don't know when the census will come out, but hopefully soon. And I'd rather be ahead of the game than behind the game. And hopefully we can focus in that area.
Now that each commissioner has spoken, Mr. Dingle, it looked to me like the way you laid out the material for this agenda item will in fact ultimately deliver what Commissioner Buck said she was looking for. Is that correct?
Chair Buck, or Chair Bernie, that is correct. And I think it's really going back and some of the research that I've done, I think it is very, very important that the board make these critical decisions, which I know you're going to make. And we're here to facilitate. I don't think anybody wants any appearance that somehow forces behind the public meeting or actually, just creating the process. So again, what I would in line with what Commissioner Buck said, if you can make as many of these key decision points as I've laid out here, then we can take that and come back with, for example, the committee structure. We can come up with the application form because again, to commit what Commissioner Buck said, there needs to be some general agreement today about what the qualifications for the applicants are, because we need to know that to request that information on the form. In other words, some of those issues that I brought up, and also whether or not I would say the key decision point there is, it was raised last time, I've done the legal research, and my clerk has, about disqualification. And my recommendation is, because this has not been, the process has not been created by a citizen group like by initiative. Courts have approved certain disqualifications, but only in those circumstances where the voters by initiative have adopted a process that would exclude someone. So what I'm recommending is that what we do with some of the concerns that were raised is that we require disclosure so that everybody knows what's out there.
If I may, let's now begin doing this methodically, if that's okay with them. I'll start with the first, and then again, Councillor Dingle, if you could tee up each next decision point in the order in which you've provided information on the materials, that I think we can move through this.
Okay.
And I'll do this for the first one. The first one basically synopsizes the desires of everyone on the Board of Commissioners through the conversations to date, which is we don't want controversies. We don't want to appear that this is anything but transparent and inclusive and accountable to the voters of Lane County. We don't, whether in fact or through optics, we want to make sure that we absolutely have a process that embodies those three items. And the first decision point Mr. Dingle gave us is, can we confirm this is still the board's desire? I, for one, it's still my desire. Do we need to discuss that? Or do we have a simple show of hands?
Point of clarification, can you repeat the exact question that you're asking us?
Well, it's on our materials, Commissioner, under number 2, creation status. Initially, the process would be adopted by ordinance, but should eventually be added to the Lane County Charter. Number 1, the process should be inclusive, transparent, and accountable. Decision point, confirm this is still the board's desire. Is this still the board's desire?
Yes.
I see 5 head shakes. Mr. Dingle, could you lead us to a little background and tee up the next decision point in your material?
Thank you, Chair Bernie. I will. You'll recall there was a number of comments about the number of people that should be on the commission. I think it was absolutely unanimous that it should be odd, so that there couldn't be the possibility of a stalemate and a tie. So there was unanimous agreement about that. Really, the difference after that tended to be on how many other members there should be. I think everyone agreed there should be a minimum of 5, in the sense that there should be at least 1 representative for each one of the commissioners. But after that, there wasn't a lot of agreement. And the only thing I would observe here is that while it's great to have a lot of members on this, at some point it probably becomes unwieldy. You probably don't want a commission of 41 people or 51 people. Well, that might give you a lot of representation. I think it would be very difficult to, to come up with, to get anything done. A number that kept coming up, I think, over and over again was 11. I didn't really keep score, but that seemed to be a good number for some people. I think that they thought that provided, if you think back on the categories that folks listed, there would be your five commissioners. There would be 6 additional folks picked. And if you think about the kinds of things that people mentioned, it seemed like those 6 members could reflect those concerns. And 11 is obviously an odd number. So that's really all. That's really what that's the decision point for the board.
Thank you, sir. Would commissioners like to speak on that? Commissioner Trieger.
Thank you, Chair Bernie. It may be that we need to go to 4 before we can decide 3, composition of the commission before we decide on the number, because I'm not clear that we are necessarily in agreement or have decided that the 5 commissioners ourselves would be part of this committee or this commission, or whether it would be truly an independent commission developing recommendations that then the 5 of us vote on, whether it's from a selection of 1, 2, 3, or however many options. So I would like clarification on whether that is already decided in some way, that the 5 of us are the first 5. And so if it's
No, it
11
has.
and an additional 6.
No, I'm sorry,
That's
Chair,
for you.
Commissioner Trieger. No, I'm sorry if I wasn't clear. What I meant was there seemed to be unanimous agreement, or maybe not unanimous, seemed to be consensus among the folks that offered their thoughts on this, that the board members not actually be a member of the committee, but that each commissioner have an opportunity to appoint at least one member of the commission. So I'm not saying the commissioner should, I don't think the recommendation from the public was that the commissioner should actually be part of the committee, but they should have the ability to appoint at least one member of the commission. So I'm sorry if that wasn't clear.
Commissioner Trieger, with that, would you still rather attack the next discussion item regarding composition, or are you good with numbers?
Thank you, Chair Bernie. Frankly, I would, because if we're going to talk about what kind of representation, how diverse, how much it should parallel, and what percentage the entirety of the county, that's going to perhaps inform how many people it would take to achieve that kind of representation, or where we're willing to limit or combine criteria or what have you.
Do any commissioners object to us skipping to these decision points that Mr. Dingle, if I'm looking at it, relate to are all members selected by the board? Are none of them selected by the board? These are the decision points I see under that. Maybe I'm wrong.
Chair Bernie, I think she's referring to what I have as numbered on page 4, which is the composition. And this goes to, isn't that correct, Commissioner Trieger? That's what you're talking about. So we've got geographic, demographic, economic, the political vote in the last presidency, people of color, rural, urban, low income, those sorts of issues, I think is what Commissioner Trieger is identifying. Do you want to?
I agree, but the first decision points you have none under that one. And the first decision points you have are under the next one. So I'm fine, however you want to do it.
Chair Bernie, if I may, I think I'm simply offering that a conversation about composition would help inform the ultimate number of people we could agree we think is required.
And unless there's objection, I tried to indicate I was fine having that discussion. Is there objection from commissioners to have that discussion? Right. Okay. Well, Commissioner Trieger, I assume that you want to say something.
I do, but I don't have to speak first. I think we probably all have thoughts about composition of the commission, so I'm happy to hear from others.
I see Commissioner Buck, yes.
So for the sake of the people that are watching, I had a question for Mr. Dingle. When we left our last meeting regarding this subject, there were some questions as to the legality of some groups of people being excluded. And I was wondering if you could touch on that a bit.
Sure, I mentioned that earlier, but I'll go into it more detail. So a number of folks expressed that they, and this was split opinion, as you know, Commissioner Buck, but there are folks who said no one who's served in an elected office for a particular period of time in the past or plans to in the future should be allowed to serve. Folks who had made contributions to commissioners' campaigns, that led down to a whole other issues of if it was a corporate a corporate contribution, did that disqualify everyone in the same corporation? If a member of the household, if one member of the household did it, would that disqualify everyone in it? Those sorts of issues. As I mentioned earlier, first of all, there isn't a whole lot of case law about this nationally. There isn't any in Oregon. The concern I think that was raised is, are there some constitutional issues when it comes to essentially disqualifying the public process because they've participated in the public process? In other words, you can't be on the redistricting committee because you plan to seek office in a year or two or whatever it is, or because you made a contribution. The way that the primary, it was California, Michigan, and the other ones are escaping me. But essentially what happened is when this process came up, that process that you're going through right now was created by the citizens through an initiative process. And essentially, when those challenges came up in California and Michigan about people being disqualified because the initiative process limited who could serve on the redistricting committee, the courts basically upheld that because they said it was this is what the citizens want, and they approved it. My only concern here is that obviously we've not gone through that process. This is a process that's being created by you, not by the citizens. So my recommendation is to avoid any potential theoretical challenges to this process, since you're the ones creating it and not by initiative, is to go with the disclosure route and simply have folks for those areas of concern that you've expressed. And I thought it was a good suggestion. I believe it was former Commissioner Sorensen, and I think there seemed to be consensus on this, that it, as a starting point, that the folks fill out the same disclosure sheet with the Oregon Government Ethics Commission to do that. But you could certainly make folks concern, and then it's out there, it's transparent. The people who are making the decisions know that this person plans on running for an office in 2 years, or that they made a donation to Commissioner X's campaign, and they felt that they could be independent anyway.
Commissioner Buck, does that satisfy the question?
Yeah, it does. And if there is legal issues with excluding certain categories of folks, I would say we should follow your advice and not do that. In reality, we want to be as inclusive as possible. That may be something that the residents of Lane County want to address between now and the next redistricting process.
Chair Bernie, Commissioner Buck, that's absolutely correct. The suggestion that came up early on in this discussion is obviously the charter currently requires that this process be adopted by ordinance, which obviously doesn't involve a vote of the citizens, but certainly those issues could be addressed, as I said, if the board went through and did propose a charter amendment as was discussed, because again, then the process would be enshrined in the charter and would be adopted by the people. And to your point, yes, one of the things that I heard over and over and over again is that folks want this process to be as non-controversial as possible. And again, I think that that's just an area of potential litigation, because it's basically an unknown area in Oregon. The safer course is, as you suggest, Commissioner Buck, to simply have folks disclose it. It eliminates one potential issue, legal challenges to the membership of the commission.
Other commissioners? Commissioner Bozovich?
Thank you. And I agree with Commissioner Buck that we should probably stay away from restricting until either it's done by initiative or there's more case law here in Oregon. Looking at Santa Barbara County's conditions, they do have limitations around contributions to candidates for Santa Barbara elected officials. But one of the things I would have to ask the question about was, does that include, say, a union president from a union that made that contribution? And does it include all the officers of that union? Does it include all the corporate executives for a company that made a contribution? It speaks to individual contributions, but it doesn't really speak to contributions from groups. So it gets really, when you start trying to do qualifications and disqualifications based on campaign contributions, it gets really complex in how we're doing it. And I think would actually, as suggested by one of the emails we got, may restrict our pool of interested people in ways we really don't want to do. So I'm not so interested in having that as a restriction. I do really support Commissioner Sorensen's suggestion that we get the same information that you would submit to the Government Ethics Commission, because one of the things we should also watch for is, is it somebody that has controlling interests, say in a corporation that does business with Lane County. And we want to see that would come up on a government ethics forum, and it could be part of the decision of whoever's selecting folks for this committee. So it's those restrictions I think we need to be really careful with until they're either passed by initiative or there's better court history here. So that kind of gets back to kind of, are we back to how many, or are we still kind of going to continue on any qualifications or restrictions?
Commissioner Trieger.
Thank you, Chair. I think this is a great example. I really appreciate us wanting to be methodical and work through the way Councilor Dingle has laid this out for us. It's really useful, but I think it's also instructive to the community who might be watching. This is, it's messy and it's interconnected, all these different pieces, and it's hard to take them in sequence because Commissioner Bozovich's comments, I appreciate all of them. I agree about the government ethics form being a great disclosure form to use, but now you've begun the conversation about qualifications, which isn't where we are. If I'm understanding the main purpose of this item 4 composition, when I look at it, it's really about representation from communities of color, from low-income folks, across parties. At least those are the very specific pieces that were brought up. And that's a little different than some of these issues of how we're going to select and qualifications. So what I would say specifically to item 4 on our materials about composition and ensuring we have robust representation from a diversity of communities and lived experiences is that we think very carefully about the difference between what I would say between descriptive versus substantive representation. And what I mean by that is that we're careful not to do box checking, particularly when it comes to having representation from communities of color, from immigrant communities, from the LGBTQ community, from low-income folks, that if you just get to check a box that you describe yourself that way, is that necessarily a substantive representation of the experience of members of our community from that group? So I think if we talk about, if we develop a set of questions for the application and we ask people to explain how would you represent the needs of communities of color or what have you, we'll get a more robust application pool, and we might get people who serve on boards or run organizations working to meet the needs of a community rather than just simply personally identifying as descriptively as being a part of a given community.
Commissioner Farr.
Thanks. I'm mainly a listener in this conversation and trying to simplify things as much as possible in my own mind. And maybe I'm oversimplifying. What about making the eligibility for the committee the same as being the eligibility for serving as county commissioner? I mean, doesn't that seem like a pretty good set of criteria? For instance, you know, you don't have to, you can be controlling interest in a company that serves Lane County, that contracts with Lane County. You can, as long as you declare it and you make the appropriate declarations. And the discussion surrounding the Oregon Government Ethics Committee forms that we all fill out annually, that is a great disclosure form. I don't know, maybe that's an oversimplification. Maybe there are great reasons to not just simply use the same criteria that we're selected on.
Commissioner Buck.
We had a similar conversation about the applicants for the Climate Action Committee. And, you know, we wanted to make sure that we had representation from a variety of folks. And I'm not sure exactly, I can't recall what the application asked as descriptors for reaching diversity. Chair Bernie, I know that you were on that board, and I'm not sure if you recall either, but I understand that, you know, the check boxing is, it's a hard, I mean, you don't want to just pick people because they checked a certain box, right? You want them to really be engaged in the community because this is a really significant issue. So how do you ask those questions to actually get to know the person as best you can on an application. But can we follow similar application descriptors as the Climate Action Committee?
If that's a question, I don't see anyone jumping to answer it. Mr. Dingle, do you have an answer other than to take a look at it?
I see. Yeah, I think I see what Commissioner Trieger has raised, and I think it's a really good point, which is there, I mean, the one way to do it would be to literally designate there will be one spot for a person of color, there'll be one spot of a person of low income, there'll be one spot urban, rural, whatever. Then I think what Commissioner Trieger is raising is the second part of that issue, which is how do you decide whether or not a person meets that criteria, which I think she makes a really good point. One way is they simply check a box. The other thing is that someone provides a more substantive answer along the lines of the question that Commissioner Trieger posed, which is, how would you represent X group? So it's really up to the board. I could certainly look at the Climate Action Committee and find out what you did. As I recall, I don't think it was the first thing that I suggested. I don't think there is a designated type of seat specifically for a position on the board, but I'll double check that.
Well, I'm going to weigh in if I may. First, Commissioner Trieger, you made a comment for the public about this being a little messy. This is orderly compared to the meetings that led up to it on this particular topic. I think this is a really good substantive discussion. I think we need to figure out how to move it forward. It seems to me that a statement of, I'm looking at number 4, composition, a statement of priorities by this board in having such a body developed, which lists all of those things, and a statement that this body should reflect the diversity of Lane County, and then have some questions that get at it without, and Commissioner Trieger, tell me if I'm mishearing you, because I think I agree with what you said, but maybe I'm projecting. But without the idea of having, necessarily numbers attached to categories, because that opens up a whole different type of can of worms. Did I hear that correctly?
Yes, thank you, Chair Bernie, for asking for clarification. I agree. I really like where I think you're going, which is developing a sort of a statement, a guiding principle for what we want to see this commission represent. And yes, exactly that. And because I think otherwise we also fall into the trap. I mean, here we're using the term people of color, but that is an enormous bucket with multiple kinds of representation within it. They are not, communities of color are not a monolith. And the Black experience in America is very different than someone who immigrates here from Mexico, which is very different from an Asian Pacific Islander, and even within each of those categories. So I think we really need, I think, a statement of guiding principle about our commitment to a broadly representative commission is really important. And something that is not on this list is youth representation, because what we're talking about is making districts that will impact the future in our community. And so I think that is another very important consideration to add to our guiding principles. Thank you.
And I'm going to try and synopsize, and then any other commissioner that wants to chime in. It sounds like perhaps the easiest and most prudent and appropriate way to move forward is with that kind of statement, identifying some of the groups, including youth, but including others as well, that are part of this conglomerate of cultures and people that we call Lane County. The number will obviously confine how inclusive that can be, but with an eye towards that, and allow the ethics, right? The government ethics submission with some key questions be the process by which composition is developed. Did I catch that correctly? I didn't because Commissioner Bozovich is raising his hand. Yes, sir.
No, I think you did really well. I was just going to make a suggestion. I'm all for plagiarize. Don't shade your eyes.
No, don't strain your eyes, plagiarize.
Yeah. Yeah. Nikolai Ivanovich Lobachevsky was his name. Only Commissioner Burney got that. Tom Lear. Santa Barbara County, you know, I keep going back to some of these California he's changed. There's still a lot of activities in a registered voter, and a few other, then they got down to things like financial contributions to candidates, et cetera, that we've already said we really can't step into. In addition, the following criteria will be taken into account: experience that demonstrates analytical skills relevant to the redistricting process and voting rights, and ability to comprehend and apply the applicable state and federal legal requirements; experience that demonstrates the ability to be impartial; and experience that demonstrates an appreciation for the geographic and cultural diversity of Santa Barbara County. And of course, it would be Lane County in that case. But I think those three things, hit on some really important things we're looking for from this commission. And the last one touches very much so on what, Commissioner Trieger is asking for is that appreciation for the geographic and cultural diversity of the county. And I think that doesn't mean we're checking a box. That means it could, we could be somebody that serves as a social worker in an agency that serves some of these minority communities or underprivileged communities and lower, not often well-represented communities. It would fit that description of having that appreciation of that cultural diversity of our county. I think those three bullet items go really well with what we're looking for. Staying within those state and federal legal requirements, ability to be impartial, and having an appreciation for that diversity does that. I also, at the same time, I'll put in a plug. I think the more members we put on this committee, the better chances we'll have the ability to have a diverse committee. The smaller we make the committee, the less ability to make sure it's a diverse committee. So just
that's probably a universal rule, Commissioner.
Yeah. I know that California's statewide committee has 14 members. This particular county has 11. And I saw some counties that had as many as 27 people on their committee in California. So just saying that it ranges from what I've seen in California from 11 up to 27.
Chair Bernie, if I can, I think I have what would be a helpful sort of merging the two thoughts that Commissioner Bozovich has just mentioned and Commissioner Trieger. I think that you could take that last statement that from Santa Barbara, which was the sort of general statement about the diversity or whatever, and you could put in a parenthetical with the specific things that you're looking for. The diversity in income, the diversity in ethnicity, the diversity in where they live, what you could pick youth, the age, those different things. I think you could put that in as a parenthetical, and then clearly the application process be very easy. Please explain how your application or your participation in this process would contribute to and refer to that specific criteria, the diversity. But I think it is more helpful, just from my perspective. I'm also trying to think of this as, I know you want to get good answers to applications. And I think the more specific you can be, the better result you'll get. So I think if you put in that parenthetical that I just suggested to add those criteria that Commissioner Trieger mentioned, it's going to make a person think when they read the application, oh, I should be sure and emphasize what specific skill set that I bring or what unique experience I bring to the process. Just a suggestion. The board's free to accept it or reject it.
I noticed Commissioner Trieger is very shy to speak her mind in these meetings. Yes, Commissioner. That's a good thing, by the way. Forgive
I
me.
gotta make up for lost time. You all have been at this for a while. And I will see your Tom Lehrer quote and raise you, Commissioner Brozovich, any day. Big fan. Thank you. Again, we're sort of skipping into the qualifications, disqualifications. I do appreciate, for the sake of moving this part of the discussion along, where we've gotten with it already. This is not a one shot at this. I do think also we could consider, we had a presentation at our meeting last week, I think it was, about the equity lens that's being developed for Lane County. So it could be that we get a draft going and maybe we run it by some of the folks doing that work on behalf of our organization to make sure we're on the right track, that we use all the tools we have within the organization to help us get this as close to right as we can this time around. And to the point that Commissioner Brozovich brought up about how there's also sort of skill set and experience required at some point when it feels like the right time on our agenda, Councilor Dingle or from our county administrator, I will want to know what the resources are to this commission from staff in terms of expertise around the more technical aspects, so that will also help us better understand screening for general community members, so that we're sure that all of those pieces are in place. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm ready to Mr. Dingle, it seems to me, unless another commissioner raises their hand and they will be called on, but it seems to me that you have enough information to develop a draft of both process and statements that would be part of an application for us to look at. Is that correct or no?
Yeah, if I can recapitulate real quickly, I think what I'm hearing is that there is not a desire to have specific characteristics assigned to a specific position on the commission. That if we were to draft up a where we talked about the qualifications to be on it, that we could take the statement, the general statement from Santa Barbara, and include in it more specific references to whatever the diversity is, and I've listed all of those in the thing, and then I've added youth and some of those other ones. That would get us there, and that then we would begin developing that application process. That would I think I've got enough to do that, where it's the basic information, but then we can also add that question that Commissioner Trieger mentioned, that we clearly list that the person is going to have to fill out an Oregon Government Ethics Commission disclosure form and attach that. I did want to point out, I do think it is different when you decide who's going to be qualified versus, and it doesn't sound like the board is interested in disqualifying people, but I would just say, you could be a rural representative, but theoretically be disqualified because of some business connection that you have to it or whatever. So the two are a little bit mutually exclusive, but I think I have enough to go here. Does it sound like there's consensus on 11 members, or is there?
Well, I'm sorry, before we get there, do commissioners agree? Are you good with Mr. Dingle's synopsis? Can we move off of this?
Yes,
Okay.
and I would just offer, I think the idea of looking at the climate action plan criteria is great. I would also offer the Equity and Access Advisory Board application as another one to look at for some example model language.
And I sent an email to the climate action folks on that very thing during this meeting. And then what I would suggest is that once we develop this process, we can say that we'll run it by the folks that are familiar with the equity lens. Yes, I've got those points down.
And if I may add into that, if any commissioner has any other application for any group that they're aware of that they would like Mr. Dingle to see, to please get that to him, Mr. Dingle, by when?
Well, it depends on when you want this back. That's when you want
let's give it
obviously the sooner the better for me.
Okay, thank you. The background material provided us by council sort of as a guide, but do you think we ought to look at member selection and then look at numbers, or do you think, is there a preference at this point? I'm sorry, Commissioner Buck.
Since nobody's saying anything, after our previous discussion, I'm okay with talking about numbers now, if everybody else is, so that we can continue to go down the list in an orderly fashion.
I see no objection. Okay, I see no objection. Does anyone want to speak to the numbers issue? I think Commissioner Bozovich had. Would you like to add to that at all, sir?
I'll just say that, you know, in the interest of trying to achieve some of the goals that Commissioner Trieger stated, I'm kind of leaning towards, I don't want to go all the way up to 27, but I'm leaning towards maybe somewhere in the 15 or 17 member range, and that it will enable us to make sure we have some of that. Then the devil gets in the details of who selects those folks and how they're selected. But I would say no less than 11. That's my kind of my low end of number of committee members.
Thank you. Commissioner Farr, did I see your hand?
Thank you, Chair Burnett. Yeah, the one thing I would mention is regarding quorums and participation in meetings. We're considering, and we will most likely move toward having specific slots filled by particular people who meet certain criteria. The larger the number of people who are in the committee, the greater the chance of people skipping meetings, for instance, or maybe not achieving a quorum for voting. Anytime a selected member skips a meeting, then their voice is absent from the discussion that day. And if that is the only member who represents a particular or a certain group, then that voice is missing from the discussion that day. We would hope and strive for full 100% participation at every single meeting, but I've never been on a committee that actually has happened. You know, so bear that in mind, that the larger the committee, the greater the chance, particularly if the slots are narrowed, the greater the chance of missing a particular voice that we really want to have at the table, that the majority of commissioners really want to have at the table. That's the only caution there regarding the size of the committee. You know, I've been involved in many committees, large ones. You know, if you look at the United Way Committee, for instance, it's huge. If you look at the Cellco board that I was on, it was very small. It was only 5 members. So the smaller the committee, the more agile it can be. The larger the committee, the more deliberate it can be. I'm not fixed on numbers. I think 11 as a minimum is the only thing I would consider.
Thank you, sir. Other commissioners? Commissioner Buck.
I know we had talked about 11 in previous meetings. I too think that's a good minimum. I'm kind of sitting on 15 members right now. I think that will give enough available, you know, diversity in the group that we can get a variety of folks. Hoping that we get lots and lots of applications at the same time. I'm hoping this is something people are interested in more so than what we've seen in our public outreach thus far. So if we go too much more than 15, I'm not sure, you know, that how many great qualified applicants we'll be getting. Hopefully I'm wrong and we get many, but I'm kind of sitting at no more than 15.
Commissioner Trieger.
Thank you, Chair. I agree. I think 15 feels like a good number. We can also claim it right now and then just circle back, as I'm sure we'll do a review of all the decisions that we've come to in this session to make sure that's still the right one. But for the sake of moving forward, I think 15 is a good number. And Commissioner Buck brings up an excellent point, which will be another discussion to have, which is what is our recruitment process to ensure that we're reaching as many people with the opportunity to participate and submit an application as possible.
And Chair Bernie, I would also mention that to Commissioner Farr's comment, part of what I'll be developing is when this will all go into the composition of the committee will be the very rules that Commissioner Farr is talking about, that talks about what a quorum is and what you do if a person's, all of those different issues, again, to be dealt with upfront rather than at the time. I've had to put out a couple of fires in between some of these smaller committees because they didn't deal with some of those particular issues. In other words, what do we do when we have to make a decision, but we don't have a quorum and our bylaws don't say what to do? So I'll deal with all of that and offer, again, you'll make the final decision, but I'll at least have that in the bylaws so that you know what's going, so that everyone knows what the rules are going in. So hopefully lessen the risk of controversy if something like that should happen.
Thank you. Did you still want to speak, Commissioner Bozievich?
Yeah, I'll just say that I'm good with 15, and I just want to make a quick note that Santa Clara County had 175 applicants to their committee, and they're approximately 5 times our size. So we were proportionally, we would expect at least 35, but they had a lot of restrictions on why you couldn't serve. So they disqualified a good portion of their population. My guess is we're going to see far more than that. So 15, I think we'll at least get 2 applicants for every position, if not 3 or 4.
And let it be noted that all Commissioner Bozievich's references are to California.
They led the way in this redistricting by citizen committee. And that's why I'm sorry if I keep going back to California, but they plowed the ground for us, and I think they did a good job at it. So I'm actually talking positively about California.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for clarifying. Well, I'm in the minority. I was going to suggest 27, but it looks to me as if this body has shaken heads and is arriving at the number 15 for now. I believe one commissioner said we can claim 15 and revisit it later. So is that good with everyone? Are there any objections to that? It looks like we can move on, and Mr. Dingle, 15 will be the number at this time.
Very good.
Is there anything you want to say to tee up these next decision points you have under item number 5, member selection?
Not really. I think it's here. I tried to make the decisions easier to more complicated. That was the order that I put them in. But obviously this is, 5 and 6 are the real, this is the real core of it. How are these people going to be selected, and who is going to be doing the selection? That's the, there were lots and lots of comments about this in your listening sessions, and it's absolutely essential, I think, in the minds of at least the folks who made the presentation, that that it be somebody other than just the commissioners, because again, that takes it one step away from removes you one step away from the process. So the thing I wanted to make clear is that there's part of the difficulty is in the devil, or devil is in the details. In other words, it's very easy to say, well, let's have somebody independent make the selection. Who is that? And even when we got to retired judges, then you have to go down to the next step, which is, well, how do we pick the retired judges? And when we say retired judges, are we talking what retired judges? Lane County Circuit Court judges, municipal court judges, federal judges in Lane County. Again, it's down in the details. So this is really the part that I think is going to be is going to engender the most conversation amongst yourselves about how you decide to do that.
Thank you. Would any commissioner like to begin that discussion? Commissioner Farr.
Thank you, Chair Burney, and I'm going to actively listen more than comment, but just one thing that I'd love to avoid. When I was on the Eugene City Council, we were selecting planning commission members, and I drew a map of every existing planning commission member for the Eugene City Council, and if every member had a child, that child would go to South Eugene High School. So it clearly weighted to a particular part of the city, but that was at a time where where 4 of the Eugene City Councilors' children would have gone to South Eugene High School also. So, making certain that each Lane County district represents an equal number of the people who live here. And so we need the geographic dispersal. It cannot be weighted heavily to one particular district.
Thank you. Other comments? Commissioner Buck.
I think this is probably going to be the nuts and bolts of our whole committee here. In past conversations, we've discussed the retired judges versus whether we want the board, our board itself, to choose the remaining members, or maybe we wanted the committee members that we've chosen to then choose the remaining committee members. On the first one regarding retired judges, I understand theoretically the intent is to get folks that are impartial to choose the members. There is also the concern that whomever you choose, regardless of whether they're judges or not, are not always impartial. And that's really hard for us to determine whether they are or are not impartial. I think it's challenging for us as board members to be the ones to choose the remaining members. I'm okay with each of us choosing one, but the rest of the 10 slots we have available, if we choose them all, I think that doesn't show impartiality very well. I lean to the last group, which is the members that we've each chosen get to choose from the remaining applications for their remaining members. We need to, though, give some guidelines on how they are able to choose those remaining members, because we want this to be impartial, not only politically speaking, but also people not choosing their friends or relatives, right? So how do we ensure that that will happen? I'm open to the conversation, though. It's just the questions that are going on in my head at the moment.
Chair Bernie, to Commissioner Buck's point, that is actually a really good place to start with this. For example, she mentioned the first decision point would be, it seems to me, that whether they're your selections or the selections from whatever additional body makes the 10, now that I'm just going to assume that there's 5 and 10, 15. Must they have filled out an application and from that applicant pool? And I think the answer to me seems obvious. It should be yes. In other words, that no matter who's doing the picking, they shouldn't really have the ability to reach outside the process and say, I'm appointing this person. Because I think that addresses the concern that Commissioner Buck just expressed, which is someone gets on the committee and then decides, I'm going to appoint my whatever best friend who never applied.
Mr. Dingle, thank you. And with all respect, and I need to say this, could you please ask to speak before speaking? Because I was about
I'm sorry.
No, it's just an oversight. Don't worry about it.
I apologize.
But I was going to, Commissioner Bozovich did have his hand up.
Thank you. Going back to multiple California counties, they go everything from, there's a county that uses retired judges to select everyone, to Santa Barbara County, that their first 5 members are selected at random, 1 from each commissioner's district, and then the committee selects the remaining 6 members. So they have random selection of the first 5, 1 from each district, and then they also balance their committee as the 6 members that they select are 1 from each district and 1 at large. So they have their geographic balance involved there. So that's one method of doing it. The retired judges does give us the ability to, one of the things that, that was important to me is that this committee look independent from the commissioners. And if we're selecting the first 5 members and then those members select the rest, that doesn't look independent as much. I kind of have a little bit of, I kind of like that idea that somehow or another there's a random selection from the pool of each district for the first 5, and those random 5 people get to select the rest based on the applications. Makes it truly independent. So, that would be one possibility. And then, I would, to speak to Vice Chair Farr's concern, if it was 3 from each commissioner's district, that would assure geographic distribution around the county. The only thing that would be troubling, though, is if we didn't get 3 applicants from one of the districts. But I have a feeling that that should not be an issue. I have a feeling we're going to get an overwhelming number of applicants for this commission, because I have a feeling that all of us are going to go out and recruit people and ask them to apply. That said, so I kind of lean towards maybe, I did originally like the idea of having retired judges do it. They have they've had to adhere to a code of ethics throughout their career. And particularly our lane circuit judges were elected countywide. So they have shown community support. Although there's that question of they aren't actually accountable to the voters in some way. If we go to some kind of random selection of the first 5 members and then they appoint, that kind of takes away us having that decision, makes them independent and takes away the complexity of trying to come up with a pool of retired judges. So sort of like that Santa Barbara County model there in that way too. Once again, turning to California, Chair Bernie.
Sam, I'm going to be sorry I ever made that comment. I'll call on you in just one moment, Commissioner Trieger, but I just wanted to say, and I think Commissioner Bozovich will agree, but for the record, when the commissioner discussed making sure it looks independent, I think he also meant that, in fact, it is independent, that it's not just optics, it's integrity here. And I think the other point that I wanted to respond to was, you're probably absolutely right, Commissioner Bozovich, but I'm committing here and now not to recruit anyone. I will encourage through different groups in the Springfield district as many people that are concerned with civics and our county and the way in which we conduct elections to apply, but I'm not going to recruit anybody. I'm sorry. And that's just me, but I wanted to respond. Commissioner Trieger, I apologize for speaking before you.
Thank you, Chair Bernie. Regarding specifically this idea of judges, I'm really torn. I understand the assumption, presumption of some neutrality on their part, but I think that's sort of a false notion. And if you're talking about retired judges, sort of even more so, because they're no longer beholden to have any necessarily. But my main concern about that is, particularly if we're talking about retired judges, the demographics of that pool, who that is not particularly representative of Lane County. So I have concerns if we're going to talk about using our equity lens. I think it is critically important that there's accountability to the ultimate decision, which means we as the elected board need to make it. But that's about which redistricting proposal we adopt, which is after we've seated a committee and they've done their work. I just want to flag that that's a difference in terms of accountability. I like the idea of randomized selection if we have a robust enough applicant pool. I'd add offer another suggestion for a tool we could use to help, which is blind applications. This is what's being done in HR departments a lot to ensure better equity in hiring processes is to remove a lot of certain identifying markers from applications so that the review committee is really just looking at the content and not making any assumptions about who the application came from based on their name or their educational background that would indicate age and that sort of thing. So I think we could look at ways to blind the applications for whatever selection body is charged with appointing folks to this commission as a tool. And finally, I'm thinking just practically, Councillor Dingle and staff support that you may have, I'm guessing you will need to develop some kind of matrix, and each application as it comes in can be slotted on that matrix and show how many of the various geographic diversity, representative diversity, and so on, any individual application fulfills, because people will check multiple boxes in that way. And that will then help, particularly when it comes to having distributed representation across the current 5 districts. That even brings up, if each of us were to appoint someone, if we're not required necessarily to appoint someone from our own district, if we just know of community members broadly that we think would be good contributors for whatever reason. So we can't even necessarily, unless we put that restriction on ourselves that say our appointments, if each of us has one, comes from our district, we could be perpetuating an imbalance if the goal is to have an equal balance across the 5 districts. So just pointing that out as well. Thank you.
Other comments? Commissioner Buck.
So unfortunately, I was under the assumption that when we chose each of our own committee members, that they would be from our particular district, but I don't think we actually discussed that. That would be my preference, just also to ensure geographical diversity. I hadn't thought of blind applications before. I really like that particular idea. The random selection idea, I like the concept. The question I would have on if we do that is, if we're doing random selection, what is the point of us asking the question about how they fulfill the part of the equity portion of the application if nobody's really reading it? I think that's really important because we still want to make sure that the group in general, the 15 folks, have all the diversity that we've been previously discussing today and in previous meetings. So if that can be addressed in the random portion, I would be more open to that.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Bozovich.
So I just want to say that the random would only be to select the first 5 members that would be selecting the remaining 10. At that point, they would be looking at the answers to questions in the applications. And I really like the idea of a blind application as far as what those 5 members look at. And then they'd be able to take into account some of those issues. It's just a matter of how do you get to the people that are going to select the committee. Do you do it by going to retired judges, which I believe Councillor Dingle could probably expound on this. Even retired judges are held to certain ethical standards. It's kind of, once you're a judge for life in a lot of ways, and there's things they can't do in retirement, because of their prior judgeship. I know I've talked to some judges sometimes, and they've said I can't do that, because I'm a retired judge. As far as political activities sometimes. So just so that was one of the reasons why that was a pool that was desired in some ways. But I think yes, the first 5, if we do those randomly, we won't be able to address some of those application questions, but the following 10 that they apply, that they can apply those questions to as they appoint them as a group. And you're going to have to get 3 out of the 5 to agree. for each appointment.
I think Mr. Dingle was going to respond to your question, Commissioner.
Yeah, or 2 points. One, Commissioner Bozovich is right. And that brings up a great, that's one of those great definitions. When you say retired, what do you mean retired? Because there are retired Plan B judges, there are retired senior judges, and there are retired judges. And he's correct. The first two, if they're on Plan B or they're in senior status, they are still hearing cases, then they have to follow the Judicial Code of Conduct. I did hear back from Mr. Hurley about the composition of the Climate Action Committee, and he basically said that they have one person of color. We didn't request information on income bracket. We have 2 individuals who are in the under 30 age. The rest of the distribution selection was based on geographic representation and experience/knowledge.
It's, if I may, it's interesting being on that committee and appointing the person of color who's the young woman. There were, now that I remember, and forgive me, I didn't, there were none of those criteria. It's just that, in my opinion, she was absolutely head and shoulders the best person of the appointments that I had at my disposal from applications.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, Commissioner Trieger.
Thank you, Chair. I wonder, as I'm listening to all of this, there might be some kind of combination again. And what I'm guessing is, Councilor Dingle, you'll go away and sort of synthesize all this conversation and maybe even come up with a couple of scenarios of how we proceed. Because one could be that it's an open process and then you give each of us blinded applications from our districts to choose, or the district applications are randomized, or there's different ways to kind of Rubik's Cube this around until all the different ways to get to the solution of making sure we have equitable distribution across districts, robust representation from marginalized and underrepresented communities, but also skill set, interest and commitment and ability and all those other things for people to be participating members. So as I'm listening, I'm already imagining a lot of different ways once we had that matrix of applications of how to mix it up to get the first 5. And I'm wondering if we're all in agreement, the notion of the first 5 then selects the remaining 10. And so therefore the real first pass tough question is, how do we get those first 5 is what we're back to, if I'm following where we are process wise.
I think you absolutely are following it. Much to my chagrin, you're a much faster student of this stuff than I was a couple of years ago. What I would like to say is that as it relates, I think everything Commissioner Trieger said is 100% accurate. I agree. I'm also, frankly, intrigued by the way Commissioner Bozovich has organized the Rubik's Cube. Because no matter, or suggested that we do, because no matter what the process, someone's going to have to identify someone. There will be connections between selection of some applicants and the selection of the final group, and the notion of commissioners in blind applications choosing someone to represent from their district, and then that group choosing the remaining members, given the criteria we've established for inclusion, transparency, et cetera. That's intriguing to me. It seems like that meets the objectives of inclusion, transparency, et cetera. But do we have further comment? And one comment we're going to need, Mr. Dingle, is, do you have enough to provide us with a member selection process draft that's consistent with this discussion and this direction?
Chair Bernie, I think I do, and again, I'll just recapitulate to make sure that I'm hearing correctly. There seems to be consensus that the selection for the composition of this committee would be, in the first instance, and there's no decision about this, whether it would be, it's clear it would be done, it would involve the 5 commissioners, and it would either be the commissioner making a selection from a blind application from their district, or a random selection from the commissioner's district, which would not actually involve any participation by the commissioner. That would be easy enough. The only criteria that would be looked at that point would clearly the application would contain a box that would say what district you live in. And I guess if it were truly random, each one of those applications would be assigned a number. You'd put them in a hat, and some neutral person would draw out a name and read it in a public meeting, and it would go back to what application that was, and that person would be on the five. The other suggestion is to have a sort of a redaction process where all the potentially identifying things are taken off of the application. That's provided to the individual commissioner, and the individual commissioner selects a person. And then that committee, it seems unanimous that the second group will be selected by however the first group is selected, by the first five. That seems to be the consensus. And then I will make the suggestion that because this is all going to go into the process of the committee, is there consensus that the commissioners should that first group should come from the commissioner's district? I think I saw consensus on that.
Is anyone not good with that?
I'll just say I am good with that. I prefer the blind application process myself, because I'm concerned that we're asking about these equity questions in people's applications, and then not considering it when it comes to us. So that's why I prefer the blind application process.
Chair Bernie, it would help me tremendously if I can do it either way. I can come up with two alternatives, but if there's consensus that that the commissioners will look at the blind application to make the selection for their district, as opposed to a truly random one, which I described, and that would make it easier for me, but I can certainly draw up both.
Commissioners, are there any commissioners that don't want the blind process? Commissioner Bozovich.
Yeah, I still have some concern about that. It still looks like we're appointing the original five, and that five will pick, and it doesn't separate and make the committee independent enough. Blind application processes, there's ways to get around and identify people. It's not fortunate, but it is possible. So I'm just a little concerned there. The randomizing of the first five assures that there's a completely independent commission. That's the only thing I would suggest. But I do like, if we are going to appoint, I do like the fact that we're appointing from our district and we're doing it on at least blind. And I really appreciate that in this entire conversation, no one's talked about party affiliations and registrations and having to divide that up in any way, because we are a nonpartisan body. And I want to just thank the rest of the commissioners that has not come up at all, which is fantastic. We're more concerned about being diverse and making sure underrepresented communities have a voice and everything else. It's like I've been really happy with this conversation all the way through. So I would prefer random, but I'd be willing to settle for the blind. So just to put that in there.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Trieger.
Thank you, Chair. Very briefly, since you brought it up, Commissioner Bozovich, but I just wanted to mention, I hopped on the elections website real quick before our meeting this morning just to see where things stood with party registration across our county. And that anyone can do this. This is for the benefit of anyone in the public. It's easy to go to the Lane County elections website and look at the month-by-month voter registration. And I think what's to me, what was most significant is actually unaffiliated voters make up the second largest group in Lane County. And given, again, as you mentioned, that these are nonpartisan seats, I think that's important to note. And so I just wanted to, since the topic came up, put that out there and offer to members of the public that it's easy for them to access voter registration by party in our county on our website.
For the public and for one commissioner, that would be me, Mr. Dingle, could you articulate the difference between blind applications and random applications as you're using and we're discussing?
With, if the selection were to be truly random, there would not be any need to do a blind application. There would just simply be some way of taking, someone would take the applications, sort them by district, assign them a number, and then you'd, like I said, you just create, 1 through 27 for district or position 1, and then someone would reach into the hat, pull out a thing and say, through number 9, you'd go back and look, application number 9 is this particular person. That would be truly randomized. And again, there'd be no reason to do a blind application because you'd never see it. No one would see it. The only thing they'd ever see making the selection would be a number. The blind application, and this is done routinely, as Commissioner Trieger mentioned, with human resources, which is where you take out information that would theoretically allow you to identify the person. We're doing that more and more now with the initial screening and things like that, so that you can't Google the person's name if you don't know their name, for example.
Right.
If you don't, if you take out a license number that they might have to have, no one can go to the the Oregon State Bar and see who's bar number 84207 or whatever. So that's what it means. So theoretically the personally identifying information would be, but you'd still have the information that you need to make the decision. I mean, if it, for example, it would, I'm trying to think of an example. So if, to Commissioner Trieger's point, if a minimum qualification for the position was like if I were recruiting for an attorney, the application I would see would just say that they're licensed in the state of Oregon and they graduated from the University of Oregon Law School. It would not tell me what year they graduated or what their bar number is.
No, I understand. So the personal identifiers are gone, but you still can look at the quality of the application.
Sure.
Thank you very much. Then I'll just add my voice to preferring blind applications. And let me give you another reason why. One of the first items of those 3 items that we discussed, I believe it was number 4, I'm not going to double check, was accountability. And what there still has to be some accountability to the public, and that's only going to be through their elected officials that they can get rid of if we're not doing our job. So I actually see this as a positive blend in that regard, but that's me. But thank you for the clarification. Further discussion? Commissioner Trieger.
Thank you. Briefly, I'll just note too, if Councilor Dingle drafts something and we've all had a chance to think about it, there are ways to subdivide within those the randomized option. For example, there could be some very fundamental criteria that we say, give me the applications that meet these fundamental criteria and randomize within them. So it could still screen someone out, and that could be something that helps us get at the more diversity representation piece. I'll just offer that.
Thank you. Further discussion.
Sure, Bernie, I would just say about that process, which is what we do with employment applications, is there's 2 different groups. There's a group that screens for what we call Mqs, minimum qualifications. And then those people screen out just the folks who, whatever, like in my case, anybody who doesn't have a current license to practice law in the state of Oregon wouldn't meet that requirement, or hasn't practiced law for at least 5 years, government law for 5 years. I'll just say this, I'm very nervous about a group outside the board doing that screening, just given some of the criteria that you've done, because I do think it could lead to someone saying that somehow staff is screening out people who should be on the thing. That's just an observation that's a concern that could be raised if there's someone outside the public process eliminating applicants outside public process.
Thank you. Do you have enough to go on, Mr. Dingle?
I think I do.
It looks to me as if, based on this discussion, and please, I'm wrong as much as I'm right. It looks like we don't need to discuss number 6 in the materials. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
And do we need to discuss item 7?
Chair Bernie, I would say based on the conversation that we've had so far, that there seems to be consensus that the point that Commissioner Buck made, which is we're not going to disqualify folks, but we are going to require disclosure. So I think that is, and we're going to, and I understand it's unanimous that the applicant will need to fill out, applicants will need to complete the Oregon Government Ethics Commission disclosure sheet. So I think that takes care of this, and at least from my perspective. But obviously, if someone on the board has a different position, let me know.
Commissioner Trieger.
Thank you. I have a quick question. I see here one of the recommended from, I think this was from a member of the public, was that a requirement be that someone be a registered voter in Lane County for at least the last 3 years. And I'm not sure what you're doing with these specific recommendations, but personally, I want to flag that as a great example of how that would not pass an equity lens muster. Somebody could have been a resident of this county for 20 years, but not a registered voter because of immigration status, for example. And so I just particularly want to flag that as an example of how some of these qualifications that have been floated can fly in the face of our equity goals.
And Chair Bernie, to Commissioner Trieger's point, one of the comments there specifically was that by someone was that it should not be a requirement that you be a registered or an active voter because you represent people who are not registered to vote and who are not active voters.
Commissioner Farr.
Case in point, I lived in Lane County 4 years before I became a U.S. citizen.
But once that occurred, the whole game changed.
But I can never be president.
Commissioner Buck.
I have a question on the disclosure form. Is that specifically the only disclosure form as we're doing the government ethics one, or are we asking these particular questions in a disclosure form in addition to that? Because as we've discussed, some of these are either don't pass equity lens issues or may not be legal. So are we asking for all those disclosures on the government ethics form or some other piece of paper?
Mr. Dingle.
Chair Bernie, Commissioner Buck, I want to make clear, I think there's a distinction between disclosure and disqualification. So we really haven't addressed that. I mean, one thing we've talked about is the Oregon Government Ethics Disclosure Form, but there may be other things that the board wants to know. So for example, I don't know, you may want to know if they're a registered voter. You may want to, but again, disclosure doesn't mean disqualification. I want to make that distinction real clear. So the board has not decided what we would have. What I envisioned was it would be one set of criteria that would be covered by the Oregon Government Ethics Commission. And then if the board chose, there would be other, because there are other qualifications. For example, if you think about the description that Commissioner Bozovich read, there's going to be things where they're talking about, we certainly would want to ask them about what their knowledge and experience is with government and whether, those sorts of things. And those would be on potentially a different, on the application, not the government ethics thing. But I think it's up to the board as to how much you want to put on there. And maybe what I'll do when I do, I don't know, you are all familiar with the Oregon Government Ethics Commission disclosure sheet, so you know whether or not it meets your personal feel or your comfort level of disclosing enough of the information and the type of information that you think should be disclosed as part of this process, as opposed to running for elected office.
Other comments? Commissioner Bozovich.
I think I want to make sure we capture this, that we weren't just talking about having the disclosures that are required by OGEC filled out, so that we know financial interests, et cetera, that we were concerned about. Commissioner Trieger also wanted to add some questions about, how would you represent, communities of color, or, diverse communities, and I don't know, Commissioner Trieger, if you want to work with Commissioner Dingle on maybe a draft of those, but I think that was part of what we asked for in the application. We were talking about when we got to this section was there were going to be some questions people were going to answer, and that was going to help us get to trying to get people that were going to keep that in mind. I wouldn't mind a question on how impartiality and that other question that Santa Barbara asked about analytical skills and knowledge of election and voting law. Those two questions also, but I think it was the Government Ethics Commission and a questionnaire.
Mhm.
Commissioner Trieger.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, Commissioner Bozovich, I agree. I think earlier in this conversation, we talked about developing a sort of checklist, and that's where that idea of a matrix comes into play. And we talked earlier in this conversation, I think Councilor Dingle took some notes about what those criteria would be, and how folks would meet them. So some of this will be check marks on an application, and some will be more essay questions, if you will. But the check marks would then give us sort of a spreadsheet, and you could see, I'm guessing we will see some really dense overlap in certain categories, and then some more like outliers that'll help us see how robust of a candidate pool do we have. In other words, if we have, for the sake of conversation, 50 people and 45 of them all fill one particular column out, but nobody another, that's really instructive to us about how robust and how diverse a pool we have, both in skill set, lived experience, and so on. And to your point, Commissioner Bozovich, about people's experience with some of the more technical aspects, some things are hard skills and some are soft skills, and the hard skills people can learn and get up to speed on more quickly, but actual lived experience and personal perspective is something that you can't teach someone in a crash course in redistricting as they prepare to participate in this committee. So I think it's important to separate those two things out.
Thank you. Great discussion. Are there any other comments on this? Because I believe, Mr. Dingle, you have enough to get back to us. Okay. It seems to me that number 8 in your materials is still something we need to have a discussion about. So if commissioners could turn their attention, number 8 identifies approval of the ICRC, which stands for, Counselor?
Well, I specifically put in my material that if you did not like it, you could change the name, but it's the Independent Citizens Redistricting Committee.
Okay, thank you.
That's what it stands for.
That's what we're talking for the sake of this discussion. The body that draws the maps should be independent, but the final decision should be made by a politically accountable body, the Board of Commissioners. And our decision point, does this board need to approve the plan? And it sounds like that also relates to the issue that Commissioner Bozovich discussed with us that occurred 10 years ago. So, Commissioner, comments, discussion.
Chair Birdie, before you start, the answer to that is an unequivocal. I'm sorry. The answer to that is an unequivocal yes. It's in the charter. The board is required by ordinance to adopt the plan. So it can't be, now it could be developed by the commission, obviously, but at the end of the day, the board as a politically accountable body will need to adopt it as an ordinance. Nobody else can do that except the Board of Commissioners.
Commissioner Bozovich.
And I was going to point that out. We do have to, and unless we do a charter amendment that transfers that power to the Independent Citizens Review Redistricting Commission committee or whatever.
The ICRC.
Yeah,
Yeah.
unless there is a charter amendment that actually transfers that, we have to make the adoption of the districts. It's in our charter that we do that. The question is how does that look optically? And that's where I was promoting, and that gets to number 9.
Right, right,
Because we've answered number 8, we have to adopt.
right.
Until we change the charter. When we're too late to run a charter amendment, we ran that clock out last year. So that gets to how many plans we should look at. And that's where I was a proponent of the committee bringing us one option and doing it early enough in the process that if we reject that option, they have time to go back and bring us another option a couple times. And maybe we set something up where if the committee brings it, after the third option, that, the board has to choose between the first 3 or something like, that's in how we set up the bylaws and the rules, and whether we adhere to them. One of the things about this whole thing is we're doing this by, our rules and setting this whole thing up. At the end of the day, we could completely ignore everything and adopt whatever we want because that's our power under the charter. Yeah, but that's what gets us the optics that look all wrong. So to try and get to the point where we're looking, we've already talked about an independent committee that's balanced and transparent. I think we've done a really good job of outlining that. The last piece of this is making sure people think it's fair. And that we didn't select the districts,
Right.
which to me I think gets to I'm a proponent for bringing one option at a time to the board, but setting up our timeline for the committee to where that option comes in, where we have the ability to go back and forth multiple times. So it's going to have to come back to us at least 2 months before the deadline.
Okay. Yeah. This is Steve. So gotcha. So thank you very much, Commissioner Bozovich. That becomes one option. We need to have that discussion, but I know Mr. Dingle wants to make a statement.
Yeah, I just wanted to make, if it wasn't clear from my materials, what I was proposing was, to Commissioner Bozovich's point, is that the charter requires that you actually adopt the plan that you're going to use to redistrict. What I was going to suggest was we create this entire process in this committee, and that the board adopt that by ordinance, so that it is, if you bid, I know it's not permanently carved in stone like a charter amendment, but it would be much more difficult to go back farther down the process and say, okay, now we're not going to do what we adopted in this ordinance. And it would also, quite frankly, because of the ordinance adoption process, it provides that last opportunity for public input and review of the process and comment on it before you finally decide this is the structure that we're going to use to develop the plan that we have to ultimately adopt under the charter. That's all I have. Sorry, I just want to make.
No, don't be sorry. That's very clarifying. Thank you. Commissioners, discussion. Commissioner Buck.
So for number 9, which I think we're on here.
Yes.
The question is, how many options do we want the committee to bring to us, at least initially? And from a committee perspective, they're going to be doing all these meetings and eventually narrow it down. But if we have this open-ended process where they bring one and we may or may not approve it, that also could seem like they have no end date to what we are tasking them to do. And, if we can if this is done early enough, then we may have time for just one at a time, but they are on they'll be probably a little bit on pins and needles to say, well, did the commissioners adopt it? Do we need to come back and meet again and redo a map? Because what I would think a reasonable person would do if that was the case, they're going to have additional scenarios already in place. So commissioners didn't like this one. Okay, the next one we're going to present is option 2 or option 3. Why don't we just do that in the first place and bring options to the board? I personally would like 2 or 3 options with them telling us their preference of those options and why, because they'll be doing an analysis of this. I'm concerned we won't have enough time to go back and forth between our board and the committee and a next board meeting, and if we don't agree, and getting it all done timely.
Commissioner, we both know the time it takes to get things on the agenda. Further discussion. Commissioner Trieger.
Thank you, Chair. I want to echo and sort of modify a bit what Commissioner Buck just said. I think we should be asking this committee to produce 3, ideally 3, but 2 or 3 options, not wedded to that number, for a number of reasons. One, it's already too late to do it early, to Commissioner Bozovich's comment. I think much like, to begin with the end in mind, we give this committee a framework that they're to work in, and what the goal is to present options that are equitable distribution of voters and all the things. And like planning a trip, we can decide where we want to go, but then this committee is going to give us options. Do you want to, take this route or that route to get there? And I think if this committee can present us with, let's say for the sake of argument, 3 options with a brief explanation of what, this option is good because X, Y, Z, this option is good because A, B, C, and so on, then we're choosing from those. My concern to Commissioner Bozovich's preferred model of 1 at a time is if we reject a proposal, then we're bringing a committee back to the table to do something that's reactive or responsive, and that can seem like we are then in more of a driver's seat of the creation of the options in a way that we are trying to avoid. So if we can have a committee that presents 2 or 3 options with explanations of the benefits of any one of them, but why they're different, then we have a real choice to make that separates us from influencing the process of what we do or don't like about the work of that committee. And I think that's really important. And I think it'll be much more time efficient and more satisfying to the committee members.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Bozovich.
So I would be supportive of them bringing multiple options if they're ranked in priority order, that they, and that the board has to vote on each option in that order. Because really when it gets down to districts, there's only going to be one set of districts adopted. So there has to be a reason why one is better than the rest. But and there are always compromises, because I know how tough it is to move lines around. There's always something that gets compromised one way or another. But there's usually a reason to pick one over another. And the committee should be able to give us that ranking. And if it comes to us ranked and we have to vote in that order, then at least it doesn't look like the commission's picking the one that satisfies us best and our political motivations in picking that one. If we vote on that top choice first and reject it in that discussion of the motion, we'll have to explain why. We're going to vote no, hopefully, and it's public record. And then we can get to number 2 and number 3 in that order. But I to save time and process, I think that's probably, I'm okay with multiples as long as they're ranked and we vote in the order of ranking.
Thank you. Other comments? Commissioner Trieger.
Thank you, Chair Bernie. I want to ask Commissioner Bozovich for clarification, and this may be getting out in front of things a bit, but in that ranking vote, because I'm not sure whether I'm in favor or opposed to them presenting them with first, second, and third choice. Would it allow an opportunity, for example, let's say one map is drawn and it prioritizes using natural boundaries, rivers and built environment boundaries, but another is drawn that gets us at the numbers, but more evenly distributes underrepresented communities, whether it's around income or gender expression or what have you. Those are two really different ways, two different right answers to the question of how to divvy up. And so would your proposal to have ranked recommendations ranked allow us to have that discussion of the relative merits of one over the other in that way?
Don't let me get in the way of this conversation. Go ahead, Commissioner Bozovich.
All right. Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think as the committee presents, they can discuss that. The thing is, Commissioner Trieger, you have to address all those items with any scenario. You can't just purely do your rep by geographic boundaries and ignore balancing population. All redistricting plans have to attempt to balance population as much as practicable. They need to follow geographic boundaries as much as practicable. They need to keep communities of common interest together as much as practical. You have to do all those things and balance those needs. And one plan should do the best job of doing all that balancing. And the committee should be presenting their number one choice to us and explaining why that's their number one choice. I think we could do that in the process of how they present and why they've ranked 1, 2, and 3 to the board, and that'll help us make our decision. But I don't think you're going to have one plan that prioritizes one thing over the other. They have to look at that to follow the Secretary of State's recommendations, our charter, and state federal law and court precedent. You have to look at all of that for every option.
Commissioner Buck.
What we haven't discussed here, but I think we have a consensus, but I don't want to speak for anybody, is one of the big contentions from the last one done 10 years ago was they presented us with several options and we didn't choose any of them. Another option was created and voted for. I would like us to see that we choose one of the committees and that be a requirement of us as a board, that however many that we are presented with, we have to choose one that the committee has put together.
I saw Commissioner Bozovich, but before you speak, sir, I think Commissioner Buck, you've also now spoken to number 10, which is, must the board adopt a plan produced by the ICRC, or can the board adopt its own plan? And what I'm hearing you say is the board cannot adopt its own plan. It has to adopt one of the plans presented by the ICRC. Am I hearing that correct?
That is how I feel, yes.
And then did Commissioner Bozovich, you had your hand up?
I had this with Commissioner Sorensen last year. It is a misstatement of fact that we chose something that wasn't one of the options that had been before the committee. The option that was chosen 10 years ago had been considered by the committee. It just wasn't the one they presented as their top choice. And to say that we drew our own is incorrect.
What's interesting about that is that that means the optics were poor, and that means that this process we're going through needs to make sure that does not occur again. Commissioner Farr, did I see your hand up, sir? I'm sorry. No, okay. Any other commissioners want to weigh in on this subject further? My preference, listening for what it's worth, I'm now just speaking as one of us, is that I would like to see this group develop 3 options I would like in its presentation to the Board of Commissioners to identify the pros and cons or the strengths and weaknesses of each option so that we can understand the thinking that went into its creation. And I see no harm in asking the body for their ranked recommendations. And I think I'm not now ready to say we have to vote on them in any particular order, but all of that makes sense to me. And I just wanted to contribute that. Further discussion. Mr. Dingle, what clarification do you need based on this discussion?
I think I've got enough that I can at least do the draft of this. The other option when it comes up, sometimes when there's when a group has to make a decision based on the number, you can certainly also do task the committee with producing no less than 2 or no more than 4. That's another option, which shows that they have a lot of discretion. The only thing I worry about sometimes is when you ask, because I've certainly been on committees where you've been asked to do something like that, and sometimes there aren't, for lack of 3 good options, right? So you kind of manufacture a third. So maybe that's something else that you might want to consider, is not less than 2, but not more than 4. That way it gives the committee, shows that the committee or the Board of Commissioners is giving the committee a large degree of discretion in how they develop, how many plans they develop.
I'm seeing head shakes. Do all commissioners think that makes sense? Okay.
Okay.
I want to remind us and the public that one of the things Mr. Dingle has done here in this discussion is he's taken the formats of the 2 seminal proposals that this body was given, that from the League of Women Voters and that from the Democratic Party of Lane County, and use those really, because in most areas they were parallel and consistent. There were a couple of areas where they were not, and has used that to guide this discussion. I think this is really healthy. Mr. Dingle, do we need to go further?
I don't think, Chair Bernie, I don't think so, because I think, unless I'm incorrect, I think it's unanimous that the board feels that it should only vote and adopt a plan that was developed by the Independent Redistricting Committee, and that's question number 11.
That is correct.
Yeah. Or excuse me, that's number 10, and number 11 is the charter and the bylaws, which essentially will be the ordinance that I plan on drafting for the creation of this. So I have what I need to at least bring you that first iteration of it in that formalized format. Because again, I haven't heard any disagreement that, for example, that this committee should operate under and be governed by the Oregon Public Meetings Act, for example. So I think that I've got what I need, and I will, when I come back to you the next time, this will be in the form of an ordinance that would be the structure of the committee, and I will identify those specific, for example, the places where there's still a decision to be made. For example, in this last thing, I understand that there seems to be the board is unanimous that the committee should rank its proposals, provide an explanation of why, or that falls into your thing, Chair Bernie, about pros and cons. The only part that's left open is how the board will vote on those proposals. That, for example, that's a decision point that it seems to me is still open.
I'm not sure that there was unanimous agreement on the ranking.
Oh,
that'd be
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I just want to check with the board.
Okay.
Does anyone object to that? You were right. Please continue.
Well, and so I just use that as an illustration of to try and narrow the decision points so that you can focus in at our next discussion of this on those points that are that need to be decided. I just want to thank the board. This has been very helpful today. I feel like you've made the decisions that you need to make, and it gives me the information I need to do my job, which is to simply is to put this in the proper format, which I think will make the next meeting much, much easier because it will be, you'll be laser focused on what you have to decide.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, sir. And Commissioner Buck, you didn't raise your hand. I'm probably reading in, but did you want to say something at this juncture?
I think it was regarding your last question about the ranking or how we vote on the ranking. I don't think we fully flesh that out, but I think that would be a good part of the discussion when you come back with the draft.
Chair Bernie, Commissioner Buck, that's right. That's what I'm saying is that there's agreement that it could be ranked. The one place that folks hadn't decided on or that the board hadn't decided on is how you would specifically vote on them. And that would be one of those decision points I would outline in the next presentation and the material.
I would like to state that even though my ears and my speaker were so poor yesterday, there was a time where I could not distinguish between Commissioner Buck and Commissioner Trieger for seconding a motion. At least this time I could see your eyes, Commissioner Buck, and I could tell that there was something on your mind. So thank you. Commissioner Bozovich.
Just real quick, I am not married to the idea of voting in rank order. The big thing I was married to was having them come to us ranked. So I would gladly give up that idea just to have consensus agreement that at least the 2 to 4 scenarios come to us with ranking one through whatever.
Thank you, sir. And Mr. Dingle, so my understanding is you will bring us a draft resolution. You will identify points that you think we need to make decisions, but any member of this Board of Commissioners can really look at any piece of that draft and decide that we really should discuss and make a decision about that piece. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. I'm just trying to, this is the reason this has been so helpful for me is that there were lots of, you saw the decision points that I had done and you've made those decisions today. So now it's much easier for me to go back and try and put that in the format of an ordinance in the form of this committee. And then that'll, I think, make it go much faster next time. And I will specifically call out those things that need to be decided so that you can focus in on. But clearly, no decision has been made today. And ultimately, as I said, I'm proposing that this committee be formed by ordinance, which is going to give everybody, including the public, ample opportunity to comment and make suggestions or tweaks on what they think that it could be done to it to improve it.
Thank you, sir. And are there any other comments from commissioners at this juncture? Commissioner Farr.
Thank you, Chair Bernie. I just want to state this right now. It's Steve Dingle. You've done a superb job of gathering together a lot of threads that came from previous conversations of the previous board, the board that did not include Commissioner Trieger. And you brought it together in a way that not only, I believe, and I can't speak for Commissioner Trieger specifically, but not only in ways that she could grasp the information, but also be an active participant in today's discussion. So Steve Dingle, once again, you've increased my confidence in your work. Thank you very much. And I look forward to you're taking the threads of today's conversation and distilling it even further. Thank you very much, Steve.
Chair Bernie, thank you, Commissioner Farr. So what I was going to say was I'll bring back, the only thing I really need is when you would like to have this come back. And I was looking at the timeline. You are actually ahead of the timeline that I proposed. So what I'm going to suggest is that I come back to the board on March 2nd with the outline of the ordinance in the committee and at least an initial draft of what the application itself could look like, and have those available for the board to review. And again, that I will just say that puts you ahead of the timeline that I've suggested in the memo that you have today, if that works for the board.
Sure. Any other items for the good of the board from commissioners? Well, Mr. Dingle, my only request is that with as much advance notice as possible, would you please let all of those entities that we've been soliciting input from know that this will occur March 2nd so they can tune in? And could you copy one of those emails to commissioners so that we might also forward that to various groups that otherwise might not be aware, so that we really can practice what we're preaching in terms of inclusion, transparency, and accountability.
Chair Bernie, I now have that email on speed dial. So yes, that's not hard to do at all.
Again, anything else before we adjourn this meeting of the County Board of Commissioners? Commissioners, enjoy the rest of your day. We have a lot of work to do. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you.